The history books gave you heroes. Dusty men on fast horses, six-shooters at sunset, outlaws who lived free and died standing up. Every single part of that is a fantasy. The real Wild West outlaw was usually broke, frequently illiterate, almost always betrayed by someone he trusted, and dead before his 30th birthday. Most of them could not shoot straight. Most of them smelled terrible. And the ones you actually remember by name were not the best at crime. They were just the best at dying in ways that sold newspapers. These are 20 brutal truths about Wild West outlaws that your teachers never mentioned. And once you hear them, you will never watch a Western the same way again. On number 20, most outlaws were dead before they turned 30. Here is the uncomfortable mathematics of frontier crime. Billy the Kid was killed at 21. Jesse James was 34, which actually made him old for the profession. The Dalton brothers barely made it to their mid-20s. Sam Bass, one of the most celebrated train robbers of the 1870s, took a bullet at 27 and died in a ditch 2 days later on his birthday. The average American male in the 1870s had a life expectancy of around 40 years. Outlaws were running at roughly half that. The reason is brutally simple. Every job you pull adds enemies. Every town you ride through adds witnesses. Every day you are still breathing is another day someone might decide that reward money looks better than loyalty. The frontier outlaw lifestyle was not freedom. It was a countdown. On number 19, Billy the Kid was not handsome. Hollywood has spent over a century selling you a version of Billy the Kid with sharp features, bright eyes, and the kind of dangerous charm that makes audiences swoon. The actual photographic evidence tells a different story. The only authenticated photograph of Billy the Kid is a ferrotype from around 1879. It shows a young man with slightly crooked teeth, a narrow chin, asymmetrical features, and what contemporaries described as a perpetually nervous expression. Pat Garrett, the man who killed him, described Billy as having teeth that protruded slightly and a general appearance that was unremarkable at best. The legend machine started almost immediately after his death. Dime novelists needed a romantic figure, so they invented one. The real Billy the Kid would not have been cast as the lead in any film. He would have been cast as the sidekick nobody remembers. Number 18. Jesse James was killed by a coward he treated like family. On April the 3rd, 1882, Jesse James was standing on a chair in his own living room in St. Joseph, Missouri, straightening a picture frame. He had removed his gun belt because he was at home. He trusted the men in the room with him. One of those men, Robert Ford, pulled a revolver and shot Jesse James in the back of the head. Ford and his brother had been negotiating with the governor of Missouri for weeks. The price on Jesse's head was $10,000. Ford collected the money. He expected to be celebrated as the man who ended the James gang's reign of terror. Instead, he was called a coward for the rest of his life. Ballads were written mocking him. He became so despised that he eventually moved to Colorado and opened a saloon where a man walked in, called him a coward to his face, and shot him to death in 1892. Jesse James died because he let his guard down once. Robert Ford died because he never understood that killing a legend does not make you a legend. On number 17, most outlaws could barely shoot straight. Ammunition in the 1870s was expensive. A single box of cartridges could cost more than a day's wages for a working man. Practice was a luxury that most people on the frontier simply could not afford. The result was that most outlaws, and most lawmen for that matter, were genuinely terrible shots by modern standards. Contemporary accounts of gunfights describe men firing multiple rounds at close range and hitting nothing but walls and furniture. The famous OK Corral gunfight lasted about 30 seconds and involved roughly 30 shots fired. 3 men died. That is a hit rate that would embarrass a first-time shooter at a modern range. The quick-draw expert who could put a bullet through a playing card at 50 paces is almost entirely fictional. Real frontier gunfighters survived not because they were accurate, but because their opponents were equally inaccurate. Number 16. The Dalton Gang's last raid was a humiliating disaster. On October 5, 1892, the Dalton Gang rode into Coffeyville, Kansas, with a plan to rob 2 banks at the same time. They wanted to outdo the James Younger Gang and become the most famous outlaws in America. Instead, they became a cautionary tale. The townspeople of Coffeyville recognized them almost immediately. While the gang was inside the banks, the hardware store handed out rifles and ammunition to anyone willing to fight. When the Daltons emerged, they walked into a crossfire. Grat Dalton was killed in the street. Bill Power died in an alley. Dick Broadwell made it about half a block before collapsing. Bob Dalton took multiple wounds and bled out in the dirt. Emmett Dalton, the only survivor, was shot 23 times and somehow lived. He served 14 years in prison and later became an author and actor in Hollywood, where he spent the rest of his life telling people how stupid that raid had been. The entire disaster lasted about 12 minutes. Number 50. Outlaws rarely bathed. Here is something no Western film will ever show you: the actual physical reality of frontier outlaws. Running from the law means no access to towns, no access to bathhouses, no access to clean water that is not also being used for drinking and cooking. Contemporary accounts describe outlaws as having a distinctive smell that announced their presence before they entered a room. Sweat, horse, leather, unwashed clothes worn for weeks at a time. The romantic image of the dusty but somehow still attractive outlaw is a complete invention. These men were covered in their own filth. They had lice, they had skin conditions, and the longer they stayed on the run, the worse it got. The next time you see a film where the outlaw walks into a saloon and every woman in the room looks at him with interest, remember that in reality, every person in that room would have smelled him first. On number 14, many outlaws had severe dental problems. There were no dentists in most frontier towns. The ones who did exist had limited tools and even more limited understanding of what they were doing. Pain management meant whiskey. Serious infections meant extraction with whatever was available. Contemporary descriptions of outlaws frequently mention rotting teeth, missing teeth, and faces swollen from abscesses that would eventually kill them if nothing else did first. John Wesley Hardin reportedly had significant dental issues that affected his speech. Jesse James was described as having a mouth full of problems that he refused to let anyone address. Imagine trying to look intimidating while your jaw is swollen to twice its normal size and you have not slept in 3 days because of the pain. That was the reality. The dashing smile of the Hollywood outlaw belongs to an era with dental insurance. On number 13, the Sundance Kid might have survived Bolivia. Here is one of the great unsolved questions of outlaw history. On November the 6th, 1908, 2 men believed to be Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid were surrounded by Bolivian soldiers in the small town of San Vicente. A gunfight broke out. By morning, both men were reportedly dead, except the identification was never confirmed by anyone who actually knew them. The bodies were buried quickly in unmarked graves. And for decades afterward, people across North and South America reported seeing the Sundance Kid alive. His family always believed he survived and returned to the United States under a different name. There is no forensic evidence that conclusively proves the man who died in Bolivia was Harry Longabaugh. The story might have ended differently than the movies tell you. We simply do not know. On number 12, most outlaws were illiterate. Education on the American frontier was inconsistent at best. Many of the men who became outlaws came from backgrounds where schooling was either unavailable or abandoned early. The result was a criminal class that largely could not read or write. Jesse James was an exception. He wrote letters. He cultivated his own legend through correspondence with newspapers. But most of his contemporaries could not have done the same. They signed documents with an X. They could not read the wanted posters with their own faces on them. The clever outlaw who always stays one step ahead because of his superior intelligence is largely mythological. Most outlaws were caught because they were not smart enough to stay hidden. On number 11, Butch Cassidy's gang had a retirement plan that never worked. The Wild Bunch was one of the most organized outlaw gangs in the West. Butch Cassidy ran it like a business. He established a network of safe houses across multiple states. He paid informants. He even reportedly set aside money from jobs specifically for legal defense funds and retirement savings. The idea was simple: pull enough jobs, save enough money, and eventually disappear to South America where nobody would find you. The problem was that nobody ever managed to hold on to the money long enough. Gambling, women, expensive tastes, and the constant need to bribe people for silence ate through whatever they saved. By the time Cassidy and Sundance actually made it to South America, they were starting over from scratch. The retirement plan failed because outlaws are fundamentally bad at long-term planning. On number 10, outlaws frequently betrayed each other for pocket change. Loyalty in the outlaw world was a transaction, not a principle. When the price was right, almost anyone would talk. Bob Ford killed Jesse James for $10,000. But the smaller betrayals were far more common. Men sold out their partners for $50, sometimes less. The reward system created a culture where trust was actively dangerous. The longer you rode with someone, the more they knew about you, and the more valuable that knowledge became to someone else. Most major outlaw gangs ended not through dramatic shootouts with lawmen, but through internal betrayal. Someone always decided that freedom and a few $100s looked better than another year on the run. On number 9, many outlaws started as Civil War veterans with nowhere else to go. Quantrill's Raiders were a Confederate guerrilla unit that operated in Missouri and Kansas during the Civil War. Their tactics were brutal, their reputation was worse, and when the war ended, their members had no path back to normal society. Jesse and Frank James rode with Quantrill. So did the younger brothers. These men had spent years learning to kill, ambush, and disappear. When the Confederacy fell, they took those skills and applied them to train robbery. The line between soldier and outlaw was blurry enough that many of them did not see a distinction. They were still fighting the same war, just without the uniform. On number 8, the Pinkertons were sometimes worse than the outlaws. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency was hired to track down the James Gang in the 1870s. Their methods were aggressive. In January 1875, Pinkerton agents threw an incendiary device through the window of the James family farmhouse in Missouri. The explosion killed Jesse's 9-year-old half-brother and blew off his mother's arm. Neither Jesse nor Frank was home. Public opinion turned sharply against the Pinkertons after that. The agency that was supposed to represent law and order had just bombed a farmhouse and killed a child. Jesse James used the incident for years to paint himself as the victim of government overreach. The Pinkertons never caught the James brothers. Instead, they gave them the best recruitment tool they ever had. On number 7, most outlaws were caught because they could not stop talking. The Frontier Saloon was an information network, and outlaws were terrible at keeping secrets. After a successful job, the temptation to brag was overwhelming. Men who should have kept quiet bought rounds for strangers and told stories about jobs they had pulled. Those strangers told other strangers. Eventually, someone told a lawman. The mythology of the silent, stoic outlaw is almost entirely fictional. Real outlaws talked constantly. They exaggerated their crimes. They gave details that made them easy to track. And then they acted surprised when someone came to collect the reward. On number 6, frontier justice was often a public carnival. When an outlaw was finally caught and scheduled for hanging, the entire town turned out. Tickets were sold, vendors set up stands, families brought children. The execution was entertainment, and the authorities understood that. Some hangings were announced weeks in advance to maximize attendance. The condemned man would sometimes be paraded through town first so everyone could see him. The actual execution was designed for maximum spectacle, not maximum efficiency. Botched hangings where the condemned strangled slowly instead of dying instantly were common, and the crowd did not always look away. This was justice as performance, and the outlaw's final role was to die in front of an audience. Number 5, many outlaws had prices on their heads lower than the cost of a good horse. A quality horse in the 1870s cost between $100 and $200. The reward for capturing many wanted outlaws was $50 or less. What that tells you is that society valued a reliable horse more than it valued bringing in some anonymous cattle rustler. The big names, Jesse James and Butch Cassidy, had rewards that made them worth chasing. But the vast majority of outlaws were simply not worth the effort. They were small-time criminals doing small-time crimes, and nobody was going to ride 200 miles to collect $25. On number 4, John Wesley Hardin killed his first man at 15 years old. The age at which some outlaws began killing is genuinely shocking by modern standards. Hardin claimed to have killed a former slave in 1868 when he was just 15. By his own count, he killed over 40 men during his career. Some historians dispute that number, but even the conservative estimates put him among the most prolific killers in the West. What nobody talks about is what that kind of violence does to a child. Hardin was violent, paranoid, and incapable of functioning in normal society. He was eventually shot in the back of the head in an El Paso saloon in 1895. He was 42 years old, which made him ancient by outlaw standards, and he never went a single day without looking over his shoulder. On number 3, most famous outlaws spent more time hiding than stealing. Here is the unglamorous truth about outlaw life. For every dramatic train robbery, there were months of hiding in caves, abandoned cabins, and sympathetic farmhouses waiting for the heat to die down. The reality was boredom punctuated by terror. You could not go into town. You could not see family. You could not relax for a single moment because someone might recognize you. The James Gang reportedly spent entire winters holed up in remote locations, doing nothing but playing cards and waiting. The Wild Bunch did the same thing in their network of safe houses. Being an outlaw meant being a fugitive, and being a fugitive meant spending most of your time hiding. On number 2, outlaws died from infections more than bullets. Frontier medicine was primitive. A wound that would be a minor inconvenience today was frequently a death sentence in the 1870s. Outlaws who survived gunfights often died weeks later from infections that no one knew how to treat. Gangrene was common. Sepsis was common. The idea that you could take a bullet and keep riding is pure fiction. You could take a bullet and die slowly over the next month as your body rotted from the inside. And there was nothing anyone could do about it except pour more whiskey and hope. On number 1, the mythology was manufactured while they were still alive. This is the detail that changes everything. Jesse James was reading his own legend in dime novels before he was killed. Newspapers competed to print the most sensational stories about outlaws, and accuracy was not a priority. The outlaws themselves sometimes contributed to the mythology, giving interviews and crafting their own narratives. By the time these men were dead, separating fact from fiction was already impossible. And once the myth-making machine started, it never stopped. Every generation since has added layers of romance and heroism to men who were, in reality, desperate, violent, and usually doomed. The real Wild West outlaw was not a hero. He was a cautionary tale that someone decided to rewrite. The Western outlaw was not a symbol of freedom. He was a symbol of what happens when society breaks down and the only options left are violence and flight. Most of them died young. Most of them died broke. Most of them died betrayed by someone they trusted. The legend was always more attractive than the reality because the reality was ugly, brutal, and short. If any of these truths hit differently than you expected, tell me in the comments which one stopped you cold. Like this video if you think the real story deserves to be told. Subscribe, because next time we are going into something even darker. The frontier towns that disappeared completely, and what was found when someone finally dug them up decades later. Stay with us.